Hello and welcome to Rational Religion, where we make sense of spirituality. In this episode of Believe You Me, we're going to be discussing Islam and evolution. This is the sixth in a six-part series on evolution and the third in a three-part series on Islam and evolution.
And if you take the ratios, you start getting some crazy maths.
Yeah. But anyway, we're going to be particularly focusing on what the Ahmadiyya Muslim school of thought has to say on the question of evolution. So we're going to be looking at the more Islamic perspective and the Ahmadiyya Islamic perspective in particular. We base our views particularly on, firstly, the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but then also in terms of modern statements, the statements of the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, which is Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, whom we believe to be the promised Messiah and Imam Mahdi. And subsequent to him, the caliphs of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, some of whom were remarkable scientists and thinkers and philosophers in their own right. So the first thing we're going to discuss before we get onto the meaty evolution kind of things is a very simple religious question. And that is something that a lot of people who are religious have questions about, and that's Adam. Prophet Adam, first man Adam, who was he? Where does he come? In the Bible, it's the creation story. If he was the first human being ever created. Is it the same in the Quran? What would you say?
So the very first mention of Adam, peace be upon him, the Prophet Adam, in the Quran are in the words where God says, "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa."
Yeah.
I'm about to place in the earth the successor or a khalifa, right? A representative.
Yeah.
The word has all these meanings. And it's a very, very rich statement because it actually frames the entire discussion of what's to come on earth, which means necessarily there was no falling from the Garden of Eden from a celestial realm into the earthly realm in the Quranic story. The whole thing happens on earth.
Yeah.
And the description of it happening in Jannah means basically a garden.
Yeah.
It means that it's in a garden state where it's a lush environment, but also that they were in an environment that had peace of mind, which was later ruined because of satanic insinuations.
Yes, but the whole thing happened in paradise. It wasn't paradise.
It wasn't literally the next life in paradise.
Yeah.
In Islam, that only happens after death.
So it's wonderful because in this one short statement of the Quran, it actually takes out a lot of the misconceptions that have been introduced into theology from the Bible.
Yeah.
So in the Bible, Adam is the first man, and he exists in paradise, and then he's thrown from paradise after his mistake to earth. So the Quran deals with all these three by saying, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. In the earth, we're about to place a successor or a representative. And a khalifa means that there must have been human beings previous to Adam as well.
Exactly. This is what the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community said. He said, this is what khalifa means. It means a successor. So in the very word itself is an indication that actually he was succeeding previous peoples.
Yes.
Now, do we have more evidence for that? Well, actually, you don't need more evidence. The Quranic statement itself is the highest form of evidence in Islam. But it has been elaborated by a statement recorded by Hazrat Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi, of course, is one of the great saints of Islam. And he wrote in the Meccan Revelations that he once had a vision. And in the vision, he saw himself circumambulating the Kaaba, which is the black cube in Mecca, towards which people pray. And he saw some people that looked, they looked human, but they looked a bit different in some ways. So he said, when did you exist? And they said, and the person said, we lived tens of thousands of years ago. I can't remember the exact date, but it's many tens of thousands of years ago. And Ibn Arabi said to him, how can this be when the time that separates us from Adam is far less than this? You know,
it's like
6,000 years, 5,000 years or so. And he said, there have been many Adams. Which of them are you talking about?
Yeah.
And then Ibn Arabi writes that he remembered a tradition of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, that said that there have been many Adams, many cycles of humanity.
Well, he said no. They said there have been many thousands of Adams in the past.
Many Adams in the past.
And the promised Messiah, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, recounts this vision of Ibn Arabi, of Hazrat Ibn Arabi in his writings, and he explains that what this actually means is that there have been cycles of humanity, and that each cycle is headed by an Adam. It's begun with an Adam, and that each cycle lasts for 7,000 years, and then then there goes into a period of abeyance, and then another cycle starts at another point in time. And so, humanity is hundreds of thousands of years old, and we find from...
Well, we don't know exactly, but at least tens of thousands of years.
From the fossil, no, we know at least 90,000 years, 100,000 years, we know that Homo sapiens have been around. And, we don't know whether it goes even back further than that, or if there are other hominids, and to what extent their intelligence is, and what extent their capabilities were. Those are things which are outside the realms of being able to tell from a fossil record, really.
So we discussed how, according to Islam, and in particular the Ahmadiyya interpretation of Islam, that Adam wasn't the first man, but actually he was the first prophet. So he was the first in our cycle of humanity. Humanity's much older. The next thing we're going to talk about is actually Darwinian evolution itself. So Darwinism, Neo-Darwinism as it's called, essentially has two main pillars. The first is this idea that everything evolves via undirected processes, chief among them being random mutation and natural selection. So undirected mutative processes and natural selection. Yep. And the second part of it is the idea that everything descended from a single common ancestor, what's called the last universal common ancestor, or loathe.
Yeah.
So to what extent does the Islamic perspective, especially the Ahmadiyya perspective, take on these two pillars? Does it agree with either one of those?
So let's deal with one at a time. I mean, the first one is about random mutation, natural selection, and we've covered it extensively in previous episodes. And, you know, we can definitely put the links below, or they'll be above there. I don't know, but they'll be nearby. And you can check out those episodes where we go in depth, not only through the science. Well, we go down through the science, don't we? Look at random mutation, natural selection. And we show that actually the latest science actually does not support random mutation, natural selection as the main driver of biological evolution. Mm-hmm. And that Darwinism has a lot of catching up to do, and Neo-Darwinism has a lot of catching up to do with the latest research. Mm-hmm. That's fine. So the Ahmadiyya position on that is very simple, which is that it rejects the idea that undirected natural processes could be responsible for biological evolution. The Ahmadiyya Muslim perspective is actually much closer to what people understand as intelligent design, mm-hmm. which is that, you know, God was necessary, or creative hand was necessary to both fashion the particular genetic information and to produce the genetic information to produce living organisms, mm-hmm. but also to curate the development of those organisms through environmental pressures.
Yeah, so God shaped the environment as well as the actual DNA.
Absolutely.
Something not really emphasised in the ID movement.
Not emphasised in the ID movement, actually. They focus a lot on the random mutation aspect of it. But there is an argument, and a big argument to be made, that actually if you need environmental processes to select for particular organisms, mm-hmm. then although environmental processes are deterministic in the mathematical sense of the term, they are still random in the common parlance.
Well, they're undirected.
They're undirected,
by
yes.
conscious mind.
They're not random in the sense of Brownian motion. Yeah. Fine. They're certainly deterministic, as we've said, but they don't have a direction, and they can't choose a particular direction, mm-hmm. right? So, for example, if a volcano explodes, next door, it'll wipe out all the most advanced organisms, humans, and it'll let pyrobacteria evolve and develop.
Yeah, so it's deterministic in that sense, yes. In that there's a cause and effect chain of what happens when an environmental pressure occurs, but in terms of a volcano being here or there, or the development of that is not directed by a conscious mind.
Exactly. So when you see the evolution of biological organisms from low consciousness to high consciousness, you know then, therefore, that there must actually be a guiding hand.
Right.
Right? So that's random mutation, natural selection. I don't think we should dwell too much because we've discussed it at such great length in previous episodes.
Yeah.
Luca, last universal common ancestor.
Or common ancestry in general.
Or common ancestry in general. I mean, people might know this better as the tree of life. So what would you say about that? So what is the concept first?
The concept is basically that, like a tree, you have a root, and then you have a trunk that comes up and branches from that. But actually, everything comes from the root ultimately.
Yeah.
And that there's essentially linear descent, and everything branches off from this and that and that.
So this is like when they say, "Oh, you're 80% the equivalent to a banana."
Yeah.
Right.
So what they actually mean is that essentially, you and a banana had a common ancestor. Ultimately some common organism which eventually turned into banana and eventually turned into you.
Right. So what's the premise of all organisms having come from the same original ancestor?
Well, the idea is basically that there's if you see similarities in the form of an organism, then they will have had a ancestor organism which had those similarities, and if you eventually trace that back, you get back to one organism originally from which everything else spawned via these mistakes, via mutations and random variation. Another aspect of this in the modern day is that the origin of life must have been an incredibly rare event.
Okay,
chemical evolution, which is sort of the field looking at that, tells us that actually the origin of life is wildly, ridiculously improbable.
Okay.
So it's much more parsimonious from an atheistic perspective.
What does that mean?
Parsimony means it's much easier to accept.
Elegant?
Yeah, exactly. it's much easier to accept that this thing only happened once. This incredibly rare event only happened once. In an attempt to explain the probabilities. Of course, even if it happened once, it's still way too improbable to have happened because, sheerly on the numbers, because, the improbabilities are wild. You'd have to have billions upon billions of universes.
So it's give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest.
Yeah, exactly. But in the biological
sphere.
So the idea of common descent is basically based on these two aspects: the fact that you have common phenotypes, and then you infer that there must be a common ancestor, and also that the origin of life couldn't have happened 100 times because it's just way too improbable. We'll just say it only happened once because that much we have to say.
And the premise of that second point, which is that it could only have happened once, is that there isn't a God. It's an atheistic premise. Because if you accept that there is a creator, then you automatically accept that if the creator wants to create 50
probabilities can be skewed by minds.
Probabilities can be skewed by a designer.
When you do a painting, and by a natural process, that's an incredibly improbable pattern that you create, a meaningful pattern which has certain intricacies. But actually, when you infer with a mind there that is affecting matter, is imposing its will on matter, then it's like, well, okay, that explains
it nicely. Right. So let's go to the first point. So the first point really is that, there's this similarities in phenotype, you infer common ancestry. Is that fair? Is that a fair inference? I mean, I can see why it's certainly a common sense inference, especially to Darwin, who was looking at it. These two things look the same. They must be from a common ancestor. The idea is that two brothers look the same. They had common ancestor, their parents. Right? So what's wrong with it?
What's wrong with that is that it's not a necessary inference to... the inference that there must be a common origin is not necessary, because the same data is equally explained by the idea that there is a common designer with certain ideas, certain recurring design memes, if you will, which are applied into different organisms.
Right.
And so this is actually... So in scientific terminology, you'd say that the theory is underdetermined by the data. So the data is compatible with different theories. So in this sense, the great rival of Darwinian evolution, which is a design perspective, is actually they're compatible with both. Right. Because you could say that there was in the same way, for instance, Van Gogh, when he does his paintings, you'd be able to see swirly stuff in the skies and the plants, right? Things that are quite different. But you'd say that, if paintings could reproduce, even then, it wouldn't be a fair inference to say that these things led on one to the other. Actually, you could very easily say there was a common mind, which is applying the same themes across completely different things.
I see. Kind of what you're saying. Stretched analogy, but I kind of get that.
Like canvas.
Okay. So basically, we're talking about a system whereby you have common phenotypes between different organisms can be explained with reference to design and with reference to a common ancestor. Is it the case that, with the evolution, with the recognition of DNA as underpinning phenotypes and organisms, now common origins is often based on not on the analysis of similar phenotypes, but on the similarity of DNA. And is it borne out that similar organisms, is it been found they always have similarity of DNA behind it?
No, which is really interesting actually, which is kind of ruined the picture in a lot of cases, because they'll find actually a very similar phenotypic characteristic which actually has different DNA or quite different DNA underpinning it. Now if the basis of inheritance is DNA, then that kind of skews the whole image that we're getting. So no, that hasn't been borne out.
So we're getting things which look similar and have different DNA. So therefore, they couldn't be related, even though they produce things which look similar. And often, sometimes, this is what they call, things that it's divergent evolution or convergent evolution, and that's the idea that different organisms which are unrelated to one another actually come up with the same solutions to the same problem to produce effectively the same biological structure.
So what the picture that comes out is that Darwin had a hypothesis which kind of made sense. Wouldn't say Darwinian evolution made sense even then, but it kind of, at least in this aspect, kind of made sense. But actually, when the DNA evolution rolled in, it's the picture started to be skewed. And there's another area where the picture has been even more skewed. This is an emerging area of evidence over the last 10, 20 years or so. And that's the case of orphan genes or taxonomically restricted genes. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So orphan genes are basically when you take an organism as a biologist and you sequence its DNA, you then upload its DNA into a bank. And that bank is a bank of all the DNA of all the organisms that everybody is doing the same thing with. So somebody in California is doing that with one organism, somebody in London is doing that with another organism. It all goes into one DNA bank. And the point of that bank is then to compare genes between organisms to try and construct this tree of life. That's one of the benefits of this, collective bank. And what they're realizing is that the theory is that if everything's related to one another and we're all from one common ancestor, the number of genes in that bank that have no similarities with other genes should decrease over time. Because as you accumulate more organisms and you put them into this bank, you get more evidence of organisms that are related to each other. And therefore you might be able to, if at the beginning you began with 2 genes that didn't have any relationship to any other of these other genes, as you add more genes into there from other organisms, eventually you're going to find a match that, it's related to this gene and this gene and this gene, right? The thing you should not see is that the number of genes with no relationship to other genes should be increasing.
Right.
That's the exact opposite of what would happen in a situation where you would, where things are all related to one another. That's the exact opposite of what would happen. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Orphan genes are taxonomically related, restricted genes. They're genes which don't have a relationship with other genes from other organisms. And their number other species, sorry. And as we sequence more DNA, as we sequence more genes of different organisms, that number is increasing. Now that is extraordinary. Now that's really important.
And how much of DNA is that per species? Or it's not always exactly one species. Sometimes it's a few species.
Yes, a collection of
but
not the family level, but just below family.
Just a few species. But often it is literally just one species will have this unique DNA. And how much unique DNA do we find in these TRGs?
Drum roll. It's about 10 to 15%.
Yeah.
So 10 to 15% of most species,
roughly, sometimes it's more,
of species has no relationship to its ancestors. It's completely unique. And the funny thing is that the genes, that 10 to 15% of those genes are the very genes that confer upon that species. Often
have been found.
Are those genes that confer upon that species its unique characteristics.
Yeah, I mean this is still an area of research, but that is some of the early findings that actually the unique characteristics seem to be produced by that. Now, so just tell me again why exactly that is so shocking and what that means for Darwinian evolution, for this idea of common ancestry.
Well, what that means is that the vast majority of genes that have ever come about have no relationship or no ancestors.
Were not inherited from a previous species.
Were not inherited, yeah. So if you consider that, if you say, let's say, just to make the example simple, right? This is just a simplification to explain it. Let's say 90% of all organisms on Earth share the same genes. And they're all descended from one organism. Those genes are all descended from one organism. But 10% of each of these billions of organisms, okay, their genes are unique. And it's unique to that particular species and were not inherited. So if you're counting each unique gene once, you find that the proportion of unique genes that are not inherited is like over 99%, right? The vast majority of unique genes that exist are not inherited. Yeah. And what that means is that in terms of the new development of information in genes, it means the vast majority of genetic information arises spontaneously. Yeah. It just pops into the tree. It just pops into an organism. We don't know where it comes from. Right?
Yeah, into a species.
Into a species. And that's really startling because you should not expect to see that in the very last rung of the organism's branch. Think of the tree of life, and the branches come up. There's an original organism, branches, all the way at the tips of the little leaves. You don't expect all the unique characteristics to be at the point where all of the information has been inherited, right? You would expect it, in actual fact, to be the opposite. You'd expect that actually in the main trunk, you'd find all the unique stuff, and then towards the branches, you just get inheritance. Yeah. And you get variation and shuffling of cards. You just get shuffling of a deck of cards, right? That's all you get.
So what you're saying is that the vast majority of, basically, as many as they're coding, different species very often have, or almost always have, unique coding DNA. Yeah. And therefore, this is something that could not have been inherited, which means it's been spontaneously produced, which means that appeals to inheritance don't explain the genome, which basically means that common ancestry doesn't work.
Yeah, and doesn't explain species.
Yeah.
Just doesn't explain species. Doesn't explain why the species with this particular unique characteristics from this particular set of genes which aren't inherited exists.
Yeah.
Doesn't explain it. But there's another aspect of the whole common origin, which is horizontal gene transfer. And now this is happening very early on.
Yeah.
So in bacterial evolution, we find that in bacterial evolution, the concept of a tree of life doesn't even exist. Okay, there is no tree of life because actually they found that bacteria were just swapping DNA between themselves horizontally rather than inheriting. They're just swapping it horizontally between themselves.
Yeah.
They're doing both. Yeah, they're doing both. Absolutely. I'm not saying they're not inherited, but they're swapping DNA, which effectively means that people describe it then as a bush of life.
Yeah, a lot of people have.
Which means that inheritance again doesn't play that much of a big role.
Mm-hmm.
And the second Khalifa, the Caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Mirza Bashir ad-Din Mahmud Ahmad, I mean, he talked particularly about, inheritance. He talked particularly about, not quite inheritance, but he talked about the concept of universal common descent. What exactly did he say?
Oh, yeah, so I'll show you the quote. What he said was, "Hence it is true that different chains of life have progressed. First elementary ones, then ones of greater complexity, and so on and so forth. However, all of these chains were independent from one another. A single chain did not evolve into multiple life forms. As such, initially very primitive forms of life came into existence, and then more complex ones were followed by even higher life forms. However, this advancement took place separately and independently. It is not true that a single lower animal species evolved until it branched off into all the species that exist today." Now that's actually a remarkable statement because he's saying that evolution happened, but it's like species evolved down their own lines. Like the earliest forms of them were basically predetermined. They had something in them, either in God's mind or actually in their DNA. We don't know, but they were predetermined.
Or both.
Yeah, or both. Of course, or both. They were predetermined to go down certain trajectories of their evolution, which is much more consistent with what we're seeing because we're seeing that that species have a lot of unique DNA. They have a lot of things that are unique to them, which you cannot explain by just inheritance from something else and a little bit of fine tuning.
Yeah.
A huge amount of their DNA, 10, 15, 20%, that's huge, is unique. So that actually, concords much better with this idea that things evolve down their own lines.
Yeah, so there was like a seed of the organism, which then over time unfurled.
Now, how do you think? Now, this will be speculation, but what are some ideas of how that could happen?
I have no idea. We do have ideas, but one thing the Quran, we can only look to what our religious text says in this because it is speculative from our perspective.
Yeah.
But the Quran does talk about evolution at length, and the funny thing is, it doesn't talk that much about animals. It focuses much more heavily on plant evolution, and it talks about how we raised you from the earth as the raising of vegetation, which we mentioned in a previous episode as well. And it talks about how there is, the plant. It refers to the plant of everything. So it talks about plants as being the basis for this kind of flowering. And I wonder to myself whether actually plants being the basis of the food chain, whether actually plants are the kind of factories of genetic information. And the genetic information in them is effectively transferred to organisms along the food chain, such that through consumption, they, in certain periods, maybe not always is activated, but in certain periods, that consumption actually results in new genetic information being incorporated into the genome. I mean, we know that our guts are full of bacteria, which are effectively, DNA splicing machines, transferring and swapping DNA millions of times.
Speculation?
It's complete speculation, 100%. But I will accept money in lieu of the Nobel Prize when whoever is watching this video and then goes away and does the research and says that actually that's the case. I'm happy with pounds. Dollars, we'll see how the dollar market goes.
Bitcoin?
No. But anyway, so actually I'm not happy with pounds. Brexit's about to happen. That's too political.
I think another way of looking at it is an interesting question is, if things are predetermined to go down certain trajectories, is it possible that things are front-loaded with DNA, i.e. they have the DNA that they're going to later acquire from their origins, which are then maybe expressed through environmental effects later on, or is that information coming de novo down the evolutionary chain?
Could be either.
We don't know. I don't even know how we're going to ever answer that.
It's interesting that the Quran refers to humans even at their most primitive state.
Yeah.
So we refer to humans as Homo sapien, and we wouldn't describe in common modern evolutionary terms. You wouldn't refer to a human as as the fish ancestor.
Yeah.
You know, if we believe that fish were the ancestors of humans,
which I find highly unlikely.
I don't believe it. I mean, evolutionary biologists will still refer to that fish, which is the ancestor of the humans. They won't refer to it as human. They'll refer to it as a fish. But it's interesting because in the Quran it talks about how humans, even at the most primitive stage of creation, it refers to them as humans. And that's a teleological way of speaking. It's referring to actually the future knowledge of God is that this thing will become this.
Yeah.
And because God is planning for it to become that, God refers to its early stages as that. In the same way as if you were baking a cake and you're kneading the dough. I don't think you do that with cakes, but you do with some of them, I think. Or you're making something, right? You're cooking a recipe.
His wife does cooking and the baking.
So, okay, when you're making a nice curry, okay, a nice salad.
A curry! Wow.
A curry! A nice salad.
For the Raj!
Shut up. If you're making a nice curry, then what you do is you brown the onions first. Now, if somebody asks you at that stage, what are you doing? You're more likely to say, I'm making a curry. Now, at that particular stage, it really does not look like a curry. It's just a few browned onions, okay? Sometimes they go charred and black.
Which you could actually eat themselves.
You could eat
They could be, call them finished products themselves.
They could be finished products in themselves. But you would describe it, at that point, you would say, I'm making a curry, okay? And that would be a completely reasonable answer. But if you're an atheist, right, objecting to the Quran, you'd be like, oh, this is ridiculous. How could you possibly be making a curry? You're clearly browning the onions, damn it! Fool! And that's what they would say. And they say that on Twitter all the time. It irritates me. Yeah. But anyway, I don't know if you can tell. But the point is, there are double standards, and that's irritates me, as you can probably tell. But, that's life. You just delete the Twitter app off your phone. That's what I did. Makes my life much happier.
Okay, so in conclusion, we've said that the Islamic perspective, especially as elaborated by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, is that Neo-Darwinism is wrong in almost all of its aspects, that undirected mutative processes and undirected natural selection is not something that can produce. Macroevolution is not something that's going to be producing hands and brains and lungs and stuff like that. You might be producing very small variation at a very fine level, which is generally through degrading your genes.
As Michael B. He has shown in his latest book, Darwin Evolves.
In very great length. And if you go to rationalreligion.co.uk, you can see a book review of that excellent book.
Yeah.
But it's not actually going to be producing big amounts of biology.
Yeah.
In terms of common ancestry, the scientific evidence is amassing against that through convergent evolution, and especially now through orphan genes or taxonomically restricted genes, find that huge amounts of the DNA is unique and therefore goes against the common ancestry idea. And actually that the Ahmadiyya view, which is that things evolve but they evolve down their own lines, is looking more and more plausible and should be looked at. Exactly how that happened is something for scientists to discover.
Yeah.
So with that, thank you very much for watching. Please do check out our previous videos on Islam and evolution. There have been 2 previous to this one. And also check out our 3-part series on Neo-Darwinism, where we critique Neo-Darwinism on its own terms.
Yeah.
But before you go, make sure you subscribe, give us a like, even if you don't like us, we'll take it. And please comment below. So until next time, thank you very much for watching, and peace be upon you.